Well, hello everybody and welcome to Unpacked Lunch. Normally on this segment, you'll find myself and Steve talking through and unpacking a little bit of Sunday's message, asking each other questions, answering any questions that come through on the comments as well. This week is going to look slightly different. In fact, this whole series is going to look slightly different because instead of me and Steve talking through what we were talking about, we're actually going to be showing an extended cut of the interviews that we've been showing on Sundays. We're in a series called Culture Shift where we've been looking at these big issues, big topics that the whole world is talking about, and we just want to get in on that conversation. And so as part of that, we've been inviting some experts in and asking them some questions. And so we just want to show the extended cut of what those interviews look like here on Unpacked Lunch. On Sunday, we kicked off our series looking at mental health. We had Erin and Steve interviewed her a little while ago, and I would probably go as far to say it was perhaps the most impactful Sunday for us as a church and for those watching, certainly through lockdown, potentially even this year. So really excited to see the extended edition of that. But just want to quickly say, if you are watching live with us, we are so glad that that is the case. Want to encourage you just to put in the comments who you are, where you're watching from, as you normally would on Unpacked Lunch, I'm sure. But also, if you've got any comments, any questions, please put them down in the comments. It would be an encouragement for the rest of us. But also myself and Steve, we're going to be replying to those in real time as well. If you're watching on Catch Up, as always, we'd love to hear from you as well, and we'll make sure to get back to any comments and questions that you have too. So without further ado, this is the full interview between Steve and Erin on mental health that we showed from Sunday. I really hope that you enjoy it.
Hi everyone, and welcome to our brand new series called Culture Shift, which we're going to be covering 4 different topics that people love to talk about and have lots of opinions about. And we're going to be exploring them through interviewing some really key people who can help us to understand a little bit about what God might be saying into these topics. So today we're looking at well-being and mental health, and I am delighted that we have Erin with us. Erin, welcome. How are you?
I am well. Thank you for having me, Steve. It's great to be with you.
It's great. Now, you're Scottish. Yes?
I am.
Yes, certainly. But whereabouts are you living? And tell us a little bit about who you are and about what you do for a living.
Excellent. So, unlike my accent, I actually hail from the Midlands at the moment. So, I am in Wolverhampton and I work in a children's hospital as a mental health nurse. I lead a service there. And yeah, I've been a mental health nurse now for 10 years. Certainly was something that I fell into, really from a passion of wanting to stand with people in their darkest moments. So I've been really privileged to do that for the last 10 years and hopefully many more to come.
Fantastic. And you're linked with a church that I'm certainly very familiar with, in that you're part of a church in Halesowen, is that right?
That's right, absolutely.
Yes, that's right. So my friend Leon Evans is your church leader, and you're very lucky. He's an amazing man. Amazing man. Yes. So you said that you wanted to look at or get involved in mental health because you wanted to help and support people. Just very quickly, how has your faith impacted what you do?
I think it's massively impacted how I see recovery. So for a lot of my service users and patients that I've worked with over the years, often they have been really stuck and have really felt very distressed at times. And I think although we have lots and lots of treatments that really do take us into the next level in treating mental health, I am also able to bring a spiritual aspect where when I go home at night, I can leave that weight with Jesus and I can pray for people and I can see restoration within people that I'm working with. So that's really lovely.
Sure, that's great. Now, mental health, it seems as if mental health has kind of increased massively over these last few years. Now, is that the case, or is it just that it's talked about and people are more open about it now?
I think there's a few things impacting on how prevalent mental health is now. I think, first of all, we're more aware of it because our communication up and down the country is far better. So if I think about sort of when I grew up, I probably didn't know anybody in my immediate family or in my immediate class group that struggled with their mental health. But now, particularly for our young people, for our youth leaders, often where we see people struggle is they will communicate on things like social media or via WhatsApp, which was never an option. So we've got the avenues of people being able to communicate now, which make things easier than previously. So I think that's part of it. I think the next part of it is actually we've had a really, really tough decade in terms of how life now looks, financial pressures, relationships, and really how society supports each other as a community. So I think that certainly had an impact on people's mental health. And then most recently, we've obviously been living through unprecedented times, Steve, and that certainly we are going to see, I think, an increase again in people not coping very well.
And what do you think that will look like? Is it just that more people will be running to the doctors? Is it? Do you anticipate more suicide? Suicides? What do you think this will look like? What are you anticipating?
It's very difficult because there's not actually a lot of research, and working within medicine, that's where normally we take our steer from, is look at the research and look at what's happened before. But we don't have a lot of research in our lifetime about what happens as a result of a pandemic, certainly not one full to lockdown. But certainly what I can say for certain is that we will have a cohort, particularly of people who may not have been as susceptible before to feeling overwhelmed and to feeling very low, who now for several months haven't had the connections and haven't had the relationships that they previously had. And I think that is something that's really key and is a really strong message, is the difference that relationships and connection can make to us as human beings. God made us in a way that he designed us to be in relationship first most with him, but also with others, and that is a great gift. So I think this period has impacted on our ability to do what's most natural. And when we've not got the things that are most natural to help us cope with everyday life, that's when things can get overwhelming. So I am expecting that we're going to see sort of different levels of people not coping. But I think the message for the church and for those that are watching today is look for those subtle signs, look for subtle changes in engagement with people who are normally there and are normally doing things alongside you, and have some brave and courageous conversations round about that.
Fantastic. So what are the symptoms, and how do people identify whether they just feel low, whether they suffer from anxiety, whether they have depression? Often it all kind of gets lumped into one. Yeah. And yet I'm sure that the outworking of it would be very different. So can you just fill us in a little bit on the symptoms of what we should be looking out for ourselves as well as looking out for in others?
So I think the most common thing to look out for is, has there been a significant change in how I live my life now? And I mean outside the boundaries of the things we're not allowed to do. But I'll give you an example of that. If you're somebody who normally exercises several times a week, and actually you find that it's becoming more and more difficult to motivate yourself, certainly that sometimes is a result of the weather and coming into winter, but that might also be a sign that actually you're not doing so well within yourself. I think in terms of appetite, often our appetite will change when we're suffering from low mood. It'll either become increased and we'll eat far more, or actually it'll become decreased and we'll not be too interested in food and what we're eating. Our sleep can often change, and sleep's a funny thing, Steve, because actually we all need it and we need plenty of it. But often when we are going through periods that are very difficult, our sleep is significantly affected. That rolls into the next day, and we can't really perform at our best if we've not put good stuff in, if we've not had good sleep, good food. So often that, again, is a contributing factor, as is having our phones out during the night and finding ourselves checking the news, checking Facebook. You know, we've certainly seen some injuries within our A&E department of phone-shaped injuries on the forehead where they've been dropped as people fall off to sleep. You know, so it is about looking at these things and saying, actually, if on a scale, if I was looking at how I'm doing life now, are there things that actually I wouldn't do normally that I'm doing now? I think in terms of anxiety, that's a word that certainly within the last decade has become more prevalent, and it has been more spoken about, which is great. And I think there's a difference between worry and anxiety. You know, worry is something that we we're sort of expecting something to happen and we're wondering how that's going to go, whereas anxiety often stops us living a fullness of life, and that can be really difficult. And I think when I try and explain anxiety to people, we need to recognise that we need a certain amount of anxiety in our life to keep us safe. You know, you should feel anxious before you cross the road. You should feel anxious before an interview. That's natural because it is potentially going to be a big change. But when you start feeling anxious about whether or not you've turned the lights off, when you feel anxious about sounds in the house and that's not normal for you, what's actually going on in your brain is your fight or flight response is going, hey, look, you're in danger. And then that starts to make us feel quite dizzy, quite sick. And these symptoms are symptoms that do need attention. You do need to speak to somebody if you're finding that you don't have everyday worries, that actually it is an anxiety that is having some physical symptoms, because there are things that we can do to help with these physical symptoms and help people step back into feeling in control again.
Fantastic. So I want to come to that in just a few moments, if that's okay. I mean, mental health has certainly, the profile of it has been raised so much. I mean, Prince William has done programmes on it. There have been various sports. So I think it was Flintoff, Andrew Flintoff, who speaks about having bulimia. He's spoken about mental health issues in the past. And other celebrities, it just seems to be that people are more open regarding speaking about it. What we don't hear very often is about how mental health affects faith. And, you know, it's almost as if to be a Christian and to have mental health issues is like a taboo. You know, that well, you shouldn't, because, you know, I jotted down some verses. So let me just read some verses to you. That the fruit of the Spirit is love, it's joy, and it's peace. It goes on to other things, joy and peace. People who struggle experiencing both of those at times. Jesus says, I tell you not to worry about everyday life. So Jesus is telling people not to worry. He says, so don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will bring its own worries. Today's trouble is enough for today. So he says that. Paul writes in the New Testament, and he says, don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank him for all he's done. Then you'll experience God's peace. There we go. So they are really great, positive verses, unless you're depressed, anxious, struggling desperately in life. And then all of a sudden, that just, can sink people. It piles guilt on people. Come on, tell us a little bit about, how do you see that? How do you explain that? How can people have hope even when that's not what they're experiencing?
I think everybody's situation is different, but there's lots of trends, shall we say, in terms of my experiences in supporting Christians with their mental health. I think I would like to say first is actually the verses that you've read there are often taken out of context in terms of this should be how you feel. Whereas actually when we look at them, it's people bringing words of encouragement, and it's people saying, hey, lay this down, you know, be filled with peace. And I think what we need to first of all remember is even people who are mentally ill, regardless of whether it is depression, anxiety, or even psychosis, often even in the midst of that, you can still feel peace. It doesn't mean that everything else changes round about you, but you can still feel peace. But I think where there isn't peace, what we need to remember as a church is we need to do exactly what Jesus did, which was to get down and to eat alongside people who are feeling very broken. It is to, you know, be the unpopular person who says, wait a minute, I'm not going to stand with the rest of you while you look down on this situation. I'm going to get involved and I'm going to try and bring some restoration here. And I think what I've often heard when I speak with people who have spoken out in church about their mental health is they'll either have one or two experiences and there'll be a whole load in the middle, but strongly it will be that actually they've been really quite well cared for by the congregation, by the pastor that's there. They might not have had a great amount of knowledge amongst the congregation of what mental ill health is, but they will have had a compassion for it, and they will have cared for that person really, really well. But unfortunately, we have got people who, when they have spoken out about their mental ill health, who've actually felt ashamed because of the response they've got from the congregation and from their family around them. And often that has been linked in with healing and prayer and, you know, you've clearly got sin in your life because this isn't something that should happen to you, and you're smiling, Steve, because you will have heard stories that really have broken people who were already feeling really, really overwhelmed and unsettled. And I think that's the challenge to the church is actually, now that mental health is being spoken about more, I don't want people to feel ashamed if they have been involved in these conversations in the past, because shame isn't something we can be attached to. Jesus doesn't want that for us. But my encouragement is now that we have the education, that we are made up of a lot of parts. God's very clear. We are more than just our body. We're more than just our name or profession. So now that we actually have that recognition that we are made up of more than one or two parts, and we recognise that our mental health is a really important part of who we are, I would like us as a church to be able to care for people in a far better way, where we recognise the parity between our physical and our mental health. You know, it wouldn't be very often within your congregation that somebody announced they've been newly diagnosed with diabetes and somebody immediately would sort of say, what sin's on your life? You know, what are you doing that you've got diabetes? Yeah. Because the reality is, you know, our bodies aren't perfect. We have been created in the perfect image of God, but unfortunately we do live in a fallen world and we are subject to illness. And when Jesus wrote these verses and when Paul was speaking, you know, the reality is these are words of truth, in the sense is that Jesus can meet all of our needs. But as human beings who live in a fallen world and who suffer from illness, we're not always in a place to be able to engage with everything that is written in the Bible. And we need to not put additional pressure on people who are already ill. And that's not okay and it's not fair. And actually there is, you know, certainly instances, as I say, of people being really hurt by church, when actually church should have been the one place that got down on the floor with them and just prayed for that peace, and stood in the middle and stood in the gap. We mustn't ever underestimate the power of standing in the gap alongside somebody. And I think the reality is if you don't know what to say, just don't say anything, or tell somebody you don't know what to say. It's so empowering when somebody says, hey, I don't know how it feels down here, but I'm just going to sit with you. You know, but we feel this need to have to say something and to sound quite clever. You don't have to. That's not what Jesus asks us to do. He asks us to come alongside people and to show people him. And that is the care and compassion we'd show if somebody broke their leg. You know, you don't get cards, do you? I'm really sorry to hear you're suffering with depression. You know, you come to church and you break your leg and all of a sudden you're on a meal rota, somebody's going around and doing your shopping. How often do we do these things for the people in our church that we know are struggling with their mental health? How often do we say, hey, can I walk your dog? Because I've noticed that you've not been out recently with your dog. So it's these little things that I feel as a church we do need to tackle and say, actually, mental health we know more about now. We don't need to go over the past. It may be that actually we do need to apologise to some people, but what we do need to do is change the way we respond going forward.
Sure. Okay, that's really helpful. A relative or a friend of mine is a therapist, and she spoke to me because she knew that we were going to be covering this topic, and she said that there are so many Christians and church leaders who will contact her asking for help, but they feel ashamed about doing it, or they do it in secret because they can't tell anyone. And that's just tragic. That's just tragic. Something which I think has really come to the fore is that men really do struggle to speak about this and to do anything about it, which is why I think there's been an increase, hasn't there, in suicide for men? Yeah. Again, just paint, why is it? Why do blokes, I mean, in a sense I ought to know, but why is it that blokes find it so hard to seek help and to speak about it?
I think, again, this is just my line of thinking. You know, I don't have a lot of personal experience in this area, but I think when we see that something's not being spoken about, we need to look around and see, is it accessible to speak about it? You know, I think particularly for my male colleagues, my male brothers in Christ in church, there is certainly expectations that are spoken over us from very young ages of who we are. You're strong, you're brave, you don't cry. And actually, we know very clearly there's stories in the Bible, if we look at, you know, Jabez, where words are spoken over him and he's been given a name and, you know, he is so aware of what his name is. And I think actually that's the same for men. If you're told that you are brave and you're strong, it can be really difficult to think, well, wait a minute, who do I speak to about this? You know, if we look at when we have connect groups, I've got a fantastic connect group at church. And particularly, you know, my female friends within the connect group will speak really clearly and really openly about how they're feeling. And then I do think to myself, do we ever really open that up and sort of say to our male members, hey, how are you doing? No, how are you feeling though? You know, probably even as a mental health specialist, I don't probe around enough, because that's the way that our culture's gone. So I think we do need to make a big shift on that culture. And particularly for males, I think it's about, particularly within ministry, having these conversations in your male ministry groups and, the ministries that run throughout the year, but actually having it as a hot topic of, actually, how do we have these conversations and who do I reach out to if I'm struggling? Suicide is, the biggest number of people who sadly complete suicide and take their own life are males, and they are sort of within that adult age group. And it's absolutely devastating. Every single life that's lost to suicide is devastating. But I think the only way that we are going to improve things is by us getting around about people and making it part of everyday conversation and looking out for some of these signs and symptoms that we talked about earlier. If they're not playing squash 3 times a week, if you're not doing these things, why are we not doing them? And I think just on the point you made there, Steve, particularly around about ministry leaders and clergy, there was some really good research done several years ago now that actually showed particularly our male clergy members were at higher risks of depression, and certainly really severe depression than the normal population. And again, it's about us looking after our leaders well, and actually checking in, because often our leaders are the ones who are pastorally steering us and they're holding a lot. But actually what we need to remember as a congregation, as brothers and sisters in Christ, is that we need to check in on our leaders and check in on you as well.
Sure. Okay, that's great. For young people, because that's who you primarily deal with, isn't it? That's it. With young people, is it the case that if in working with them when they're younger, does that prevent things for when they're older, or is it that they learn to manage?
I think the research does show us that the majority of mental ill health, so when we're looking at actual mental health conditions, the symptoms of these conditions do start by the age of 14. So for a massive amount of people who are unwell as adults, the symptoms will have been sort of prominent at an earlier age. So the thinking round about really trying to do our utmost to work with our young people around their emotional and mental health is that we want to be able to prevent them requiring sort of more care later on in life. If we think about our mental health, there are parts that really are knocked by life events, so by what we'd call trauma. And trauma can look really different for everybody. For some young people that I speak with, it can be losing a guinea pig or a hamster. For others, they can have gone through things that should never have happened to them. So that can be an impact on your mental illness later on in life. We know that where children grow up in adverse childhood experiences, that actually it doesn't just impact on their mental health, but also on their physical, and again leads to more mental ill health, addiction in their later years. So by having that earlier intervention, you're really trying to build some really good skills within our young people that can help with their thoughts later on in life, that can pull on measures when things are getting really tough, so that we are less likely to see a crisis. So that's really the main aim of really trying to have really robust conversations and support for our children and young people.
Okay, Erin, that is brilliant. So what advice would you give to someone regarding their mental well-being? What steps should people take?
So I think there's a few things. I mean, there's 5 ways to wellbeing. If you go on the NHS website and Google 5 ways to wellbeing, it's basically step-by-step stuff looking at what we're involved in, daily exercise, the way that we live. And then interestingly enough, one of the things round about the 5 ways to wellbeing is serving. So volunteering and being involved in something, because it gives us community, and actually serving is really good for our souls and for how we feel. So I think that's really important round about that. I think it is about what do we do in terms of coping strategies when things aren't going well. So I think often as Christians, we should and do go immediately to put our worship on and to read our Bibles. And I think that's really important. We shouldn't underestimate the power of what we put in our head, because actually it goes into our heart. And certainly I know myself, particularly when you feel overwhelmed and not in connection, just sticking that worship on and flooding yourself and almost having mantras round about, I will sing these words. And, there's the song, The Goodness of God. Sometimes speaking these things out really does help our mental health, because we're actually able to say, right, actually, I'm going to believe this even when I don't feel it. And that can be really helpful. I think another thing that can be really good for our mental health, absolutely, is fresh air, is exercise. I'm a big advocate of dogs. Steve, but that's not an NHS professional opinion. But dogs do just make life a little bit better, if I'm honest. But it's having a purpose to get up.
I know, no one welcomes you home in such an enthusiastic way as a dog, eh? That's true.
Absolutely. If you need to see joy, you just need to look at a Labrador, a chocolate one in particular. But it is about looking at having purposeful activity in our life, because that certainly does make things much better. Just on that topic, in terms of church, it's just come to me there. What I have seen previously is actually you'll have people who serve in really prominent roles within church, and actually when they start to struggle with their mental health, they maybe can't be as committed as they previously have been. And that sometimes can lead to isolation, plus them feeling they've let whoever's leading that down. And what I would really bring to that is if you are leading a ministry of any sort, whether it is car park, coffee, tea, when we get back together, and you know that somebody is not able to commit because of how they feel, and some days they're not able to get out of bed, can I please just encourage you to continue to give the invite there, because there will be days they are doing well and they can come. And actually, if you look again at the Bible, God used people who were broken all the time, used people who were not well within their own mental health. These when we're in these points, we still have ministry, but it's about us as a church caring and saying, actually, this will be available if you are fit, but if you're not fit, it's okay. Because there is a reliance sometimes just to pull the plug and say, well, you know, I want to take this off you. I don't want you feeling overwhelmed. But on the other end of that, that can feel really lonely. Yeah. So, yeah, just to fit in with that, that's another top tip. And I think the most important part is if you feel that you're not feeling well, go to the GP. You know, go to the GP.
Call, is it the best first call?
Yeah, absolutely. Your GP looks at throats, you know, does your blood pressure, but the GP is also fantastic about speaking to you about your mental health. They have these conversations every day. So prior to me working in this role, I worked in a GP practice for 2 years, because we had so many people coming in and talking about their mental health. But the GP will have a wealth of information locally about where you can speak to somebody, what you might be able to get involved in. There's lots of things going on in the voluntary sector that will improve our well-being. And then obviously for those who are more poorly within themselves and maybe have some physical symptoms, then the GP would also look at medication.
Okay, yeah, and that's it. So, but what if the doctor recommends medication? I don't like taking tablets. I don't want to get hooked on them. There is a real fear that people have, and that they start to feel better, so they'll stop taking them because they don't need them anymore.
Yeah. Okay. So I think, this is a massive one, I think, and I think far bigger in church than it is outside of church, if I'm honest, round about medication for mental health. And I think there is, first of all, a couple of myths about medication that's given for mental health conditions. So the first bit about it being addictive, there are medications that are addictive that aren't specifically for your mental health that previously people would have been provided for things like anxiety. So our benzodiazepines and our diazepam can be quite addictive, and they were given previously. They're not prescribed as often now, but the medications that are most likely going to be prescribed for depression or anxiety are a group of sort of drugs known as SSRIs, and they're not addictive medication. They're actually serotonin uptake inhibitors. Getting a little bit scientific now for all you sci-fis out there, but what that does is it's actually about increasing the serotonin in our brain, which is the chemical that allows us, in short, to feel joy. So it's not something that works immediately. It's something that takes time to build up, and therefore is also something that takes time to build down, knock down, shall we say. And that's why it's really important, actually, when we're looking at medication, to really ask the doctor questions. You know, think about, why don't I want to take this? If the doctor was giving me medication for my blood pressure or for diabetes and was saying this would be the best treatment, would I not trust that this doctor has my best interests at heart? And I think particularly for the church, we must be very careful when we're talking to people about medication. And we must recognise that actually God gave us people who found their calling in being a doctor, who found their calling in being a GP, who found their calling in making medications. And actually, he wants these to be used as part of the way in which we seek help and the way in which we get treatment and become able to experience a fullness of life. So I do understand people's fear around medication. I do believe we've got a lot of myths that need busted. But I also believe as the church that we should be encouraging people to take medical advice from medical people, and that actually we shouldn't really speak into that at all.
That is really freeing, really releasing for people who will be watching to know that that's okay, that that's a good thing to do. So just finally, you've been brilliant. Thank you. What advice would you give the church community about caring for those who struggle with mental health illness? What's the culture shift that you see the church needs to be making?
So I think the first thing is recognising that you don't need to be a mental health specialist in order to support someone in their mental health. But equally, you shouldn't pretend to be one. That's really, really important in church as well. But actually, when it comes to low mood anxiety in particular, what people need most is to be in relationship with people. And to be in that relationship, whether they're having a good day or a bad day. So it is looking at actually, can we set up a buddy system? If somebody's coming to you, it may not be that actually you're the right person to support 50 people in the church, but it might actually be that people have identified themselves as being people who enjoy bringing others along and standing with them when things are really tough. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is just being careful with our words, Steve. That's the biggest thing. Words, we all can be careless with our words. And actually, they're the one thing that is very, very difficult to take back. You can't, they're there and they're done. But we've talked about a few examples today of just how words can be used in a way that is not helpful. So I think thinking about our own language, particularly around topics such as healing. So again, looking at the way in which we speak about healing within our church, lots of people being prayed for within their mental health and not immediately seeing any recovery or healing, that in itself doesn't make you feel much better at the time. But being able to have honest conversations about how people feel when they have been prayed for, and really just look at, how do we feel about our theology as a church? How do we feel about healing? And let's not separate the mental health from anything else, because actually we're whole beings. So actually the healing's maybe not in the way that we wanted it or how we saw it, but actually should we also be praying for other things around that, like peace, like relationships, like all these other things that God could work through and do things through. So I think language around about healing as well is really important. I think, as I said, not isolating people. So if they're involved in church life and in ministry, just because they've pulled out a couple of times because they're having a really hard time, it's about making sure you keep connecting in and allowing us to give ourselves permissions. One of the things I do with my team is talk about what permissions do we give ourselves on a daily basis that allow us to really step into all that we've been called into. And if we look at ourselves as Christians, I mean, my dad's a vicar, and he gets up at 5 o'clock every morning, and he has done his morning prayers and all sorts by the time I'm even out my bed. And very much, even on his worst day, he would do that because he wouldn't give himself permission not to do that, because it's very much, this is how I should be. But actually, if we give ourselves permission to actually, on the days that we don't feel 100% and don't need to turn up, to not turn up, that can make all the difference, so that when we are turning up, that we're fully present. So I think it's about giving permissions and allowing people to go gently with themselves. There's a lot of talk around about self-care. And actually, again, me and my dad at times have funny discussions about this. I think at times he sees that when I speak about self-care as being indulgent. But actually, we know that we can't pour from an empty cup. Jesus, there are lots of people in the Bible went away and rested, and God restored them and they came back. So we need to look at, as a church, are we encouraging people to see rest as being really important? Are we encouraging people to take time out? I'm a massive advocate for the Premier Inn. I book myself in there once a month, Steve. I'm really not embarrassed about it, but I love to just go there and just, relax with Jesus and just be completely chilled out in a bed where I've got a good night's sleep guarantee. But it's putting these things in as a church and saying, actually, we're going to have this on the top of the agenda. How are we caring for ourselves so that we can go out and care for our communities and we can care for those that we love?
Erin, that's brilliant. I am so grateful for your insight, for you just giving us the time. And obviously, the work that you're doing is vital. And I just love it that you've created time to invest in us and to help us. So, Erin, thank you so much.
No problem. It's been lovely, Steve. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.